Deviants. Santanu Bhattacharya discusses his book with Sandip Roy and they'll be in conversation with Debnita Chakravarti. Can we have them on stage, please? He won the Desmond Elliott Prize Residency in 2023 and the Mo Siucharan and Life Writing Prizes in 2021. His first novel, One Small Voice, was an Observer Best Debut Novel of 2023 and was shortlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award and the Society of Authors Gordon Boker Volcano Prize. He now lives in London. His latest book, Deviants, The Queer Family Chronicles, is out now. With him, we have Sandip Roy, who's a podcaster and columnist living in Kolkata. He hosts the Sandip Roy Show for Indian Express and is a columnist for Mint Lounge and The Hindu. His work has appeared in outlets like the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, BBC, Economic Times, First Post, NPR, and the Times of India. His audio dispatch from Kolkata, which airs on KALW Public Radio in San Francisco, has completed 500 episodes. He has been part of the anthologies like Cat People, Contours of the Heart, The Phobic and the Erotic, Out Stories from the New Queer India, House Spirit, Drinking in India, and Freedom Papers from the Edinburgh Book Festival. His debut novel, Don't Let Him Know, has longlisted for the DSC Prize and has won the APALA Honor Title in the USA and the Likho Award in India. Lastly, we have Debnita Chakravarti, who is an associate professor of English at Sri Shikshayatin College, where she tries to get students who are reading to learn to read as well. She has been a Charles Wallace Scholar with a visiting fellowship at the University of Southampton. She has taught at Presidency College and Calcutta University and also taught French to management students. Alongside presenting and publishing academic papers, she enjoys freelancing as a creative writer. Welcome.
Thank you, Sanjana, and welcome Sandip and Shantanu to this panel. As part of the KLM team, we are very excited to present Shantanu's new book, Deviants, at this festival to a very special audience here. And I'm also delighted to have Sandip as part of the panel. He's one of my favorite columnists and a wonderful addition to a panel like this. Let me start by congratulating you, Shantanu.
Thank you.
On your second book. And maybe because I think most people are yet to read the book, they will be picking it up today at the bookstore. Can you just start off by telling us a little bit about the book?
So, Deviants is the story of 3 generations of gay men. They're all part of the same family. So, they are uncle, nephew. They're related. And it is told in a structure where we get to hear from every character in turns. So that we kind of shine the spotlight on each character. And it's looking at the lives of these 3 generations and kind of going through staying with them on their journeys. But also through that, we're looking at kind of how attitudes to homosexuality have shifted in India, the legal landscape, the changes that we saw in the 2010s, some successes, some disappointments, and what it means to also be queer and out and proud now. Because I think there might be a bit of a misconception that we have solved all the problems and all's fine now. And I did want to, while acknowledge the strides we've made, also highlight that every generation will have its own set of issues to deal with, and we're very far away from done.
Right. So as you say in the book somewhere, 3 renegade young men over 50 years. And that's the kind of story that you're telling there. Sandip, just on this point of fiction writing, does it bring back memories of your book? And was it the same kind of story that you were trying to tell as well?
Is this on? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Debnita. And it's, I must say, after having moderated several panels, it's a pleasure to be a panelist. Um, but no, when somebody was interviewing me today about, writing and queer themes and things like that, and I said, uh, what is most wondrous to me is that I grew up at a time when finding one queer character in something felt like a revelation and something to be treasured and coveted and protected. So I used to edit a magazine called Trikon in the US, which is the oldest South Asian LGBTQ magazine out there. It started in the 1980s. And when I was editing it, we decided to do an issue that was about queer representation in South Asian literature. We filled 2 pages basically with the entries. There had been an anthology called Lotus of Another Color out, but we also included, Vikram Seth's Suitable Boy, because if you persist with that giant book around page, 257, you will encounter a lovely same-sex love character, but you had to persevere. And then we included other ones where they were of sort of South Asian-ish identity, may have been, may not have been, but okay, they were brown and queer enough to shove into our list. To fast forward from that, where one gay character on page 453 was enough for us to have an whole article about it in Trikon, to a book where you have 3 generations of gay characters in one family, is indeed a huge sign of where we've come. And so it is delightful to pick up a book that's called Deviants at a time when, these deviants will be in the front of the bookstore on a bookshelf. We're going to have a session like this at a lit meet. None of this was imaginable. Even 10 years ago, when I went to Jaipur Literature Festival, there was a sort of queer panel kind of thing. But I think they called it something like, whatever, there were these code words, right? Taboo tales or topics, because we couldn't really say the word out loud. And from that to have come to a book called The Deviants, I don't know, Shantanu, if 10 years ago, if you had written this book, if someone would have said like, oh, I don't know if you can call the book Deviants.
I mean, there's a reason why this isn't my first novel, right? Because I'd written a short piece, which then gave me the idea to kind of, expand this to book length. But that short piece, and then I put it away, and for years it was lying in one of my folders. And then finally, I think in 2021, I sent it to a life writing competition, submitted it, and then it won, and that's where the journey began. But I felt like I had to do a lot of work with myself for a story like this to come out. This is my coming out. Like, it can't get bigger than this as well, because as a gay person, you keep coming out every day. And you're always calibrating, fine, you tell your parents, but it never ends there. That's the start. You tell your parents, you tell some friends, and then, you start from there, and then you're asking, should the relatives know? Should the co-workers know? Should the people on the street know? And then I feel like this is the culmination of my coming out. So it's taken a lot of work to write this book and put it out there. And I honestly don't think anybody would be interested in publishing it. Even 5 years ago. I do think that the decriminalization of 2018 has given us legal cover, if not anything else. We're still kind of way, way away from the kind of social acceptance that we should have, the kind of safety and security that we should be guaranteed. Marriage equality is still a big struggle. So we have a long way to go, but at least I think the decriminalization has given us the legal cover to whoever wants to self-identify, whoever wants to put their hand up, whoever wants to create content and put it out there, that we can do it now. So I can see why Jaipur called it the taboo tales 10 years ago. And, this is testament to how far we've come.
It reminds me of a teacher who taught us Edward II by Marlowe and never once mentioned homosexuality. She called it unnatural friendship. So the entire
That's
play.
that's a good title for a book.
I still
Your
remember
next
that.
one.
Unnatural friendship.
Your
Thank
next one, you can claim it.
Unnatural friendship. All of you are my witnesses. I'm claiming it, whether I write this book or not.
But
I
this
did want
is-
to make a point
Sure,
also on what
sure.
Shondeep was saying. That I feel like, so I grew up through the 90s, those were my teenage years. And, you know, I feel like now when I look back and now when people tell me this had a queer element, that, page 257 of this book, and I felt like I was constantly looking for material and I was just not finding. And that's also because this was pre-internet, this was pre-Google, and you couldn't walk up to the librarian in your school and ask, "Ma'am, what gay books do you have?" Right? So I think even if there was content out there, and some of them were partially sort of queer, I think a lot of us have just grown up without any of that. And that's where film comes in. And I've written quite eloquently about films because I feel like I needed to do that hat tip to films where, the space that books or the gaps that books had left or the lack of books had left, that's where films came in for me in a big way. And when Fire released, for example, and then my brother Nikhil
Even
released.
Dilwale Dulhania, you write so beautifully about
Yeah.
that scene.
And there's that whole kind of, that space that space of imagination and space for art and queer stories, that then kind of took over from what the books weren't giving me.
Actually, when Shantanu was talking, I was suddenly reminded that, in fact, I remember going to the USIS library on SN Banerjee Road, and I would look up their catalog, and I saw that they were supposed to have a copy of Allen Ginsberg's Howl, but it was never on the shelf. And I felt like I could never go up to the librarian and say, do you have Howl and when are you getting it? Because I felt that would instantly expose me as to why are you wanting. And I think the reason it was not on the shelf is probably someone like me borrowed it and stole it and did not return it because they were so starved of images. And I remember the first time I went to then visit my Pishi who lived in London, and I got to go to a public library and I just found Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin right there in the shelf. It wasn't hidden away, and I could just check it out and bring it home and read it. And that felt like such a revolutionary act.
I remember even reading the review of Fire in the newspaper was a multi-part act because I was reading and then like my father would walk in and I'd put it away and then he'd leave the room and I'd read it again because even reading a review of why are you interested in Fire, right? Like even that could be so exposing. So we had to watch our backs all the time.
In fact, the Trikon, the magazine I mentioned, we edited. We used to have it come out in two formats. One was like a normal, A4 sized thing. But then that same magazine would be printed in a smaller, narrower format. And the reason with a soft cover, and the reason we did it like that was because it could then be slipped into a normal magazine and people could read it somewhere without revealing they were reading something called Trikon, which said LGBT South Asian. So you could slip it into your Outlook or whatever Sunday or whatever magazine you were reading and read it in a public space and not be caught.
Never let them know.
Never let them know.
No, this is amazing. Actually.
But in Deviants, I was also very interested. I think we are that generation where, there was some information, there was some awareness, there was some of this out there. There was also, I think, something about, us going to English medium schools and having access to world literature. And, the conversations that were happening in other parts of the world. But Shukumar, who is the oldest character, he's a young man in the 1970s, and he's very kind of like Bagh Bajar, North Calcutta, very Bangla, very Bangali, struggling to get a job during the Nakshal period and all of that. And I really wanted to explore what homosexuality could have meant for him. Without access to all of these things, without any sort of conversation in his milieu, what would it mean for him? Like, what does his personhood look like?
And that scene where the partner gets married and he takes out the sari and That's so very touching. And this is something that when you read the book, of course, you experience firsthand. But I'll request Shantanu to talk a little bit about these three men, three different voices that you'll have. You're telling the story refracted through these three voices. How difficult was that? How challenging?
It was actually very easy to write. I think the challenge was, so I'll just set the context. So there are three men, and each have kind of each has their own chapter, and you keep coming back to their stories from time to time. And each story is told in a very different voice. So Vivan, who is the youngest, he's 16 in present day. And his story is told through a very kind of, he's recording voice notes. So they're almost like transcripts that we are reading. It's very Gen Z lingo, almost annoyingly so. And that was a risk, because I felt like no one's going to take my book seriously, because, 1/3 of the book is in Gen Z lingo. But I did want to persist, because I felt like, the people today, they have the language, they have the knowledge, they have the tools, they have the mediums. They just pick up their phone and start talking, and they know that they will find an audience. And so there was no other way to tell Vivan's story. Mambro, who is his mama, and he was kind of grew up in the 1990s, very close to my generation. His story is told as a memoir, because he is writing to his younger self. Because I feel like my generation, when we were growing up, like we were saying, we didn't have the information. Even if we did have the information, we didn't quite know what to do with it. We didn't have the tools, we didn't have the mediums. And then, so we are kind of processing our lives in retrospect. And this is true for, whether you're queer or not. All my friends now, we're just going through this phase where we're like, oh, that also happened. Remember, we were so stupid. How did we not think that was the case? And we're all kind of just constantly trying to process different life experiences. So that's how Mambro's story is told. And then Shukumar's story, because Shukumar's, spoiler alert, Shukumar's not around anymore. He's died at the end of the book. So Shukumar's story is told in very kind of classical realism, third person. I chose a very conventional way to tell his story. And it wasn't a challenge at all, because I felt like those were the right voices to channel those three stories. The challenge then was, how do I not make it seem like three different novels? How does it seem like one coherent piece of work? And how do I not kind of yank the reader out of one voice? And I am yanking the reader out of one voice and putting them in another and then another. How do I sustain their interest through that? So enough has to happen in every chapter for the reader to feel quite engaged.
Right. And you talked about audiences. I'll come to Shondip on that. When you're writing gay fiction, what is the perception? What is the audience perception? Who are you writing for?
That's interesting, because my book Don't Let Him Know came out long time ago, and but it was pre 2018, pre legalization. So at that time, when it came out, it was not necessarily marketed at all as anything gay, but it had a gay character, definitely, but it was a novel about secrets. And in fact, even when I was writing it, I was more interested in the character who was the wife of the gay man in it than in the man himself, which is why somebody later asked me, oh, you've written this book, this gay novel, which I was like, okay, I don't know that I have. But he said, there's no coming out scene. Okay. And I was like, that's true, because in my head, I was not focused on his coming out story per se. I was more interested in what happens when this woman discovers that the man she has married has this other life. So I'm sort of interested in her coming out in a sense. So in terms of audience, I was not really thinking about that, and I didn't even know that there could be much of an audience for queer fiction particularly. It's only when you go to festivals and then you're put on a panel for taboo tales or queer voices or whatever, you suddenly realize that this is this is the way books are labeled and classified and sold. And to this day, my sort of most hilarious reaction to it was, I had a hard time getting the book published, not because of the gay content or anything, but because at the time I was in the US and, it was, uh, people kept saying like, oh, you've written about Bengali immigrants in America, but we already have Jhumpa Lahiri. And I thought like the point of having Jhumpa Lahiri was to open the door, not for having the door kept being shut in your face in the thing. We already have Jhumpa Lahiri, we don't. Right. And it was then when after my book finally gets picked up and published and all of that, I went to a lit fest and someone said, so are you like the gay Jhumpa Lahiri? Oh. And, and I was like, well, if you want to compare me to somebody who has won the national
you should have said she's the straight Sandip Roy.
I am like, sure, you can go ahead. But this is, we want to label people in various ways. And in the end, I think books will find their audiences. And I feel that even though, for example, Shantanu has written a book called Deviants about 3 generations of gay men, there's literally Mamar Badi Rabdar, which they're all mamas for some reason. Yes. Has written about these 3. I think in the end, a lot of the issues of identity, finding out who you were, feeling like a misfit in a family, actually transcend the gay part. And I think and hope that many other audiences will also find resonance in this book, because ultimately, we are all writing stories about looking for love, happiness, and whether it's with the same sex or like there is a funny section in here where you realize how far you've come, where the youngest person in the book, the one in Gen Z, is throwing around the terms like, we are polyamorous, or there was like homo flexible, which was a new one for me. So all these new terms have come up. But in the end, as with all 3 characters, you'll see in the end, however conventional or Gen Z or homo flexible or whatever, in the end, you're looking for some kind of happiness and a connection with somebody.
And on this topic about labels, Shantanu, how are you managing labels like literary fiction, gay fiction, from your first book to your second? What has changed?
I think, my 2 books are so different. My first book is a political book. Well, it is the journey of a young man. It's very, very political in that sense. And it talks about the rise of the Hindu right wing. It starts with the Babri Masjid demolition. It talks about friendship and relationship with family and so on, chosen family, etc. This is very different. So in that way, anybody who would care about labels would probably not write 2 books back to back that are so different. So the fact that I did it just says that I really am not into labels at all. I think we can choose to live in a post-label world. I'm very lucky that I've found publishers who don't push me down any one route. I know that's not the case. So a lot of people would have to do things because their publishers are asking them to. I'm very lucky that way that I found publishers who are very respectful of my boundaries, but also kind of, how I want to be, where I want to break boundaries and where I want to draw boundaries as well. I think the best way to write is not think about the reader at all, because there are so many kinds of readers. And I've heard a lot of people kind of say that, oh, I write only for Indian readers, I don't write for Western readers, and then people will say other things. And I just think there's no one kind of Indian reader either, and there's no one kind of, an 18-year-old reading this book knows nothing about how it was, in the Nakshal period in the 70s, right? Even though they might be in the same city. So I just think that you have to do right by your characters, and you have to find a way to tell the story well. I do think about how it reads to the reader, because there's also the risk sometimes, as an author, you're so in your head and you're so in love with the text and the story and the language that there is a risk of losing the reader. So I do think about that. I think about how this is translating onto the page and how the reader will come to it. But other than that, I don't care about whether it's male, female, straight, gay, old, young. It could be whoever. And this book especially, I was a lot more confident because I saw that with my first book. I really saw how it was read by so many people, and so many people related to it. They all found their own connections with the book. Somebody liked this part, somebody liked this character, somebody liked this scene. And that gave me a lot of confidence to really not think about any one kind of reader at all.
Right, right. Is there a paragraph that you'd like to read for us? Anything that comes to mind?
To choose which man?
I'll just read the prologue, which is short enough. The man in your dream is the man of your dreams. He is in his 20s, handsome in a Bengali sort of way, luminescent chestnut skin, effortlessly slim, bespectacled, not very tall, his hair flirting between wavy and curly, crowding over his broad forehead like Kalboishaki clouds on the horizon. His smile pricks perfect dimples into his cheeks. His chin has a cleft. In this dream, you're a grown-up too. You and he are dressed in dhuti Punjabi. You're out and about in the grand old city. It is the best time of the year there. Durga Puja celebrations, the annual worship of the Mother Goddess over 5 days. In a blur around his face are adverts in neon, heads of people, decorative facades of pandals. You and he walk, fingers intertwined, stand among the throngs with joined hands to witness the Shondha Arati at dusk. You fell asleep on the lawn. Light presses down against your eyelids now as you wake. But you're still dreaming, one slipping into another, no friction. The young man is wrapped around your senses, face radiant, eyes playful, fingers stroking the hairs on your forearm. The sky is a smudged rainbow. And even though you're only a boy of 6, and everyone in your world is husband, wife, child, and you've never known a man to love another man, you feel love for this man, and feel his love reflecting on yourself, as though reaching across into the mirror, touching the face. And that is how, still little, held up by the earth, illuminated by the gloaming, you know you are different, you're precious. It will be over 30 years before you feel this way again.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And while we are reading, Shondip, is there something you'd like to read? Maybe to set the context or the background?
Sure. I thought, because my book is so old that instead of reading from my book, I'll actually read from a more journalistic piece. And because it's Kolkata, I thought this might make more sense. It's a piece I'd written here not that long ago. Park Street has a new selfie spot these days, the rainbow flag outside the iconic Trinka's restaurant. It's not just an LGBTQ plus pride flag. Trinka's has started Pink Social Saturdays at the tavern as a queer-friendly karaoke and adda place for those who like their nightlife a little low-key, basically for older people. One Thursday, I listened to a young man gamely do stand-up about his Bumble dating encounters. Someone sang Bob Dylan, while someone else brought down the house with Pia tu Ab to Aaja. It was standing room only. A friend said it reminded him of Christopher Street in New York in the heyday of the gay ballroom scene. That was the African American and Latino underground queer subculture made famous in the documentary Paris in Burning. The ballroom scene wasn't just about fabulous costumes and voguing. It was a response to racism in drag queen pageants, which mostly had white judges. It was also about creating houses with names like the Royal House of La Beja or the House of Aviance. The houses were led by mothers and fathers, often drag queens, providing a chosen family to those who didn't feel at home with their own families. LGBTQ plus narratives, whether in New York or Kolkata, have often been about letters of the alphabet looking for a home. With Section 377 criminalizing queer lives, many assumed that home could not be a place like Calcutta. I know gay Indians who used Section 377 as a basis for an asylum claim in the West. Yet it was this Calcutta that saw the first Pride March in India in June 1999, though it was called Friendship Walk. Activist Ovais Khan, one of the original Friendship Walk participants, said he wanted to celebrate Gay Liberation Day with at least a small padayatra with pink triangles and rainbow-colored peacocks. The Friendship Walk was meant to happen in different cities across India, but the furor over Deepa Mehta's film Fire scuttled all those plans. That's why I thought, since Fire is part of his book, this is the non-fiction part. Calcutta was the only city that didn't see fire protests, so it ended up hosting the Friendship Walk. About 15 people showed up in bright yellow t-shirts in the pouring monsoon rain. Pavan Dal, founder of the local gay support group, Council Club, remembered walking into the state's Human Rights Commission office. The junior official who met them was completely surprised about what this issue was. What is lesbian? What is gay? What is bisexual? And I'm going to stop to say Pavan is actually here. So we've come a long way since then. Trans women appear on reality shows like Zee Bangla's Didi Number One to talk about both their businesses and their transition journeys. Former Chief Minister Buddhadev Bhattacharya's daughter has decided to become a trans man named Shuchetan. A queer panel at a literary festival is nothing extraordinary anymore. After Section 377 was reinstated by the Supreme Court, Vikram Seth took to the stage of the 2014 Kolkata Literary Meet and read a poem he had just written, which ended with the lines, "To sneer at love and wrench apart the bonds of body, mind, and heart with specious reason and no rhyme. This is the true unnatural crime," like unnatural friendships, that he recited it in the shadow of the Victoria Memorial, a marble edifice to the woman who gave us the corset of Victorian morality, felt specially fitting. As Malavika Banerjee, the director of the Literary Meet, said, it was a way to reclaim and reimagine what the Victoria Memorial stood for. Of course, there's a long way to go. And many LGBTQ plus Indians who had moved to places like the US found themselves stranded in the very white bar cultures of cities like New York and San Francisco. Arvind Kumar co-founded Trikon in San Francisco. He was a good old-fashioned Desi, right? IIT, educated engineer, US graduate degree in working in Silicon Valley. He said he founded Trikon because wherever he went, he felt he had to check one identity at the door. Gay at the bar, Indian at the Diwali potluck. He just wanted to be both at the same time. So he and his partner Ashok opened their home to scores of people like them. When I went there, I felt like I had come home. There was dal on the stove, a carefully nurtured curry pata plant in a pot, and the smell of mustard seed tarka, and always a place to crash. This was like the houses of Paris and Burning, you know, a chosen family and home. And the joke was, whenever we started dating anyone, it was not serious until we brought that person home to meet Arvind and Ashok. So now, you know, I'll skip this part where America has changed to the point where I don't know if you're aware, recently there was this enormous success of Bengali American Shayok Misha Chowdhury's play, off-Broadway play called Public Obscenities, following Choton, a queer PhD student, and his African-American boyfriend, Rahim, in Calcutta. It got enormous critical acclaim for bringing Bengaliness and queerness together on the stage. When they received the Drama Desk Ensemble Award, Devashish Roy Chaudhary, who plays the uncle of Pishamoshai in the play, said he was grateful the audiences had gotten a peek into our homes in Calcutta and seen a story that was intimate, complex, and clear. At one time, many of us felt the need to separate those worlds. Finally, the walls are coming down. Literally. Roy Chaudhary, who played the Pishamoshai on stage, is married to my ex-neighbor, whose house was as much home to me as our own house in Calcutta. He is, in fact, my own Pishamoshai. Not Mama, but Pishamoshai. And after this year, I don't, you know, now there are Bollywood gay weddings happening in San Francisco. There's a lot of, you know, rainbow stickers, pink cocktails during Pride Month, same-sex marriage. But I just wanted to say, in the end, it's all about finding a sense of home. Without that, nothing else matters. In India, we make a distinction between house and home. But in Bangla, we just say bari jachi when we say we are going home. one pride flag on Park Street does not a movement make, but I hope in some small way it reassures many queer people that this too can be home.
Beautiful. Well, every walk matters and every panel matters. And before we take questions from the audience, maybe I'd like Shantanu to reflect on something that I was reading in Shondip's article about freedom not being a binary but a spectrum, and it's always work in progress. So, whatever you're writing, is it always about freedom in some sense?
I think, I mean, it is. In this book, it definitely is. But I think more than freedom, it's also just about, how do I put this? You know, when you're queer and when you've existed and grown up, your most formative years are led in silence, shrouded in silence and shrouded in denial and in a very kind of homophobic culture with no legal cover. I think it's also just about, more than freedom, it's about reckoning. It's about reconciliation with yourself and knowing who you are, what you stand for. You know, sometimes, you know, from what Shondip was saying, and I've read other accounts as well, I'm quite jealous that they found this home in a way that I did not when growing up. And I wish I had those spaces and I had those communities. And a lot of it was self-censorship. A lot of it was knowing, you know, telling myself that I don't belong there. I don't belong with them, but I also don't belong there because I have to be a certain kind to access that space. I have to dress in a certain way. I have to speak in a certain way. And once I go there, there's no coming back. Once I go there, I'm ostracized from this world. So I feel like more than freedom, it's just that kind of knowing that it's not duality, it's a spectrum. And you can exist here, you can exist here, and you can exist anywhere in between. And you can kind of move the dial yourself based on, you know, what you want to do, where you are in your life, and so on. And I think that's true empowerment, to know where you want to stand on that spectrum and to be able to realize that for yourself.
So on this note of, you know, opening some doors and closing others, let's open up the floor to our audience. And if there's any question that you'd like to ask, then we'd be happy to take a couple of questions.
Thank you. This question is for Shantanu. As you go back into the past, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago or more, you find that the terms, expressions, labels, and so forth that we have now are missing. And they weren't there, and there was really, in many ways, not much of a language. And without the language, the reality too kind of was hidden or immersed or almost inconceivable. So in your novel, when you write about the first generation, did you have to do a lot of research, or did you kind of use your imagination to think of those times? I'm just curious.
I didn't do a lot of research because I think it's quite dangerous to do a lot of research for a novel and then end up with so much research and not know what to do and confuse yourself. So my process always is to start writing and seeing where I go, and wherever I need information, I can pause there and look for that information. I spoke to a lot of people who are now in their 60s and 70s to understand what their experiences were like. I did some reading up, and a lot of Shukumar's story is actually based on an uncle of mine. So I had kind of that very personal into that character's life. So I didn't have to kind of imagine how they lived, what they ate, what their milieu was, and so on. So I was kind of thinking a lot about that milieu and the house that I've gone to multiple times. But you're right in that the language did not exist. And so for that generation, I was very careful not to use the word gay at all. And in fact, Shukumar himself balks at, did us to call himself a homosexual. And when his lover says that we are homosexuals, he says, no, I'm not a homosexual. I'm actually just Shukumar. And that's all I want to be. So sometimes And there is it's fact that a lot of language did not exist, but sometimes even if the language was foisted on them or on us, like I'm thinking about myself, it's taken me years to call myself gay. We rejected it for a long time until we came to terms with our identity and said, now I'm ready to call myself that. So it's as much what exists in the world, and as much as it is you yourself wanting to take that mantle on.
I've always wondered, when you talk about coming out to your parents, do you wait for your mom and dad to ask you, or do you go up and talk to them?
Well, why are you looking at me?
Because I want both of us to answer this question, just because there's no one way to come out. So you share
Sure.
yours first.
I don't think there's ever a right, perfect moment to come out. You keep waiting for that sequence, that thing to happen. And I tried to do it by sort of actions. Like I was living in San Francisco at that time, and my parents were visiting, and they stayed with me and my then boyfriend in a one-bedroom apartment where I set up a place for them in the living room. I thought, now they'll figure out, like, we had two men living in a one-bedroom apartment. My mother said, oh, what a sweet boy. He gave up his living room bedroom for us and moved into the bedroom with you. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to have to do it. And then it was one trip back to India, and I finally decided I need to do this because the marriage question had been coming up and stuff. And I had started editing Trikon, and I was afraid somebody else would out me to my parents before that. So, yeah, I realized they were not going to ask me. So I had to sit down and tell them. And it was an awkward and difficult conversation, mostly because, again, I was trying not to use any sort of, I was trying to do it in Bangla, not because they didn't understand English, but I didn't want them to think this had happened because I went to America. So I was trying to do everything, and I made it all very Indian. At that time, Bill Clinton was president in America. And I did everything, and after that, my father said, oh, yes, but even your president can't make the armed services. Then they were trying to do this don't ask, don't tell policy had happened. So he was like, even Bill Clinton is unable to, make America accepting of this. How will you manage? So I'm like, so much for me trying to keep America out of this discussion. But that was my, I don't know. What was yours like?
I layered it. So I told my sister first, and then I told my mother, and then finally I told my father. And actually, I should have done it in reverse because my father was the coolest about it. My mother was a bit taken aback, and my sister just couldn't kind of get to terms with it because I had not told her for so long. So that was her major issue. But I think there is no one way. A lot of people get outed, which is very tragic. There is a big language issue here, because a lot of the language that we use in, a lot of LGBTQ terminology is Western terminology. I cannot imagine somebody who speaks only Bangla and has parents who speak only Bangla or Hindi or Telugu or Tamil or whatever, sitting down and having that conversation face to face without using a single English term. So I think there's a huge kind of privilege of language as well, as to how much comfort you have. I think parents now, I mean, this is also a certain kind of parent, and Vivan's parents are like that. They will ask. So I know a lot of my friends are asking their children quite early on, are you gay? You can tell me, we love you, and so on, so that they're making it known that the children have their support. So yeah, I think there are different ways of doing it. I think it's just two things about coming out. One is it has to be on that person's time. So I came out quite late. It has to be on that person's time. So we need to give that person their journey to go through different kinds of loves and heartbreak and choose their own path. Some people only tell the world when they have a partner. Some people are more kind of in their person. They want the world to know about their sexuality regardless of whether they are partnered or not. So one is, on their terms and on their time. and the other I forgot now. Sorry.
No, and also I think in terms of partner or not, also I think it's very important. Sometimes if you feel uncertain, you need to be financially able to support yourself before, so that you know if things go south, you can take care of yourself. But when you said you came out in Les, I also did the same. Came out to my sister first, then my school friends, and then eventually my parents. And every group of people said, don't come out to the other group. We can handle it, the others will not. And in fact, when I finally was going to tell my parents, because literally I was going to leave for US after that, one of my oldest school friends who's a doctor said, ও আচ্ছা তাহলে আজকে আমি বাড়ি থাকবো, because in case you suddenly need a doctor after this conversation. And the next day he said, you didn't call me at all. I'm like, no, it wasn't that dramatic.
But it's very interesting about the language part, and there was a panel earlier, language is a queer thing. Many of you must have attended that. And one last question we can have.
I wanted to ask about self-censorship. So this is for both of you. But Shantanu, I really enjoyed your first novel. I feel very guilty that I haven't read this one, but I promise I will get to it.
It's not out yet, by the way, so you still have time.
Yeah. So I wanted to, when you were writing this book, so were there moments where you found yourself consciously holding back? Because I found many writers, gay writers all over the world saying, oh, as in coming out is that first gay, but we can't be too graphic, in terms of sexual. I remember Alan Hollingher's partner, Paul Mendes, he wrote Rainbow Milk, and I was surprised by how graphic it was. It took me back to Alan's novel, The Line of Beauty, for which he won the Booker Prize. But he's been toning it down subsequently every book since, and he seems to be quite content with that. I don't see a problem with that. And one of the lines that's always stayed with me is the late Abhik Sen reviewed Rituparno Ghosh's Chitrangada, which was the last film that came out in his lifetime, and there was that one line that's lodged itself in my head which said that he compensates for the homosexuality almost by hyper aestheticized Tagoriana, and almost as if the directorial imagination cannot is sort of is constrained by the idea that you can't have two men in a relationship in bed and happy. So were there moments ultimately where you found yourself holding back on all those scores?
So I don't hold back when I write, and that's a good thing about not imagining your reader is that you don't know who's going to read it, and you're not thinking about them at all. You're not thinking about my mother's reading this book right now, and I'm not even asking her, Ma, what do you think, because God knows what page she is on and which scenes she's read. So I don't hold back at all when I write. And then I have to practice some sort of kind of dissociation where once it's out in the world, I'm extremely embarrassed that people are now reading this. Some people I know, others I don't. And something that was only in my head, a scene, or I've kind of taken from somewhere or maybe borrowed from some sort of personal experience, is now for the world to read. And it's very embarrassing. And then I have to practice some sort of kind of postpartum dissociation to say, this is not my work, or I don't care what people think, because if I start bothering about that, I will start self-censoring. There's a lot of sex in this book, that's fair to say. I need some sort of certification. There is a lot. I'd love to say that it's all contextual, it's not gratuitous, but who knows? Wherever I felt
we don't mind if it's gratuitous.
Yeah,
either.
I mean, wherever I felt like these characters wanted to have sex, they were having sex. But it's not just about sex, though. I think like sex is now, gay, straight. It's now pretty common. You see it in Bollywood as well. Like, anyway, I won't go into details, but you see quite a bit of it. So I don't think that's as much a taboo anymore. For me, it is, that scene where he wears his widowed mother's shari, and so there are moments where there's so much self-doubt and self-hate, and just admitting to yourself that I'm not fitting into this world. What do I do with my effing life? I think it is those moments that are so wretched, and for me, that's where I didn't want to stop myself. Sex, fine, if I write a line more or less, it doesn't make a difference. But it is those moments where they're very private moments where they're feeling really, really wretched about their life. And that is where I didn't want to stop myself.
And in fact, when you're talking about holding back, it was when my book Don't Let Him Know was being edited. my editor, Dia, who was at Bloomsbury, was the one who told me, you know, that chapter where the story where the gay character goes to a cruising area. I think that actually needs more sex. You've like held back. So she actually made me rewrite it to describe the sex. So the sex there is actually thanks to her, not to me. But I think there is. I mean, we do self-censor. But I agree with Shantanu is that sometimes we self-censor not the things everyone thinks you would the sex, but other things that feel weirdly private to us, and you don't know who's reading it. For example, with my book, you said your mother is reading the book now. Before my book came out, I gave the manuscript to my mother to read, and I was a little nervous because, you know, we've had the coming out conversation, then like not talked about it after that, right? And then suddenly there's a book with queerness and all of that in it, and she was unfazed by all the queer stuff, but there is a scene in there with a great grandmother and the wife in the mother in the book and their altercation, and she read that and she said, oh, but I wasn't that mean to your great grandmother. So everybody looks for whatever they want to find in the book.
Absolutely. It can be, sex might not be the most intimate things that you can share, but this is the book that you can look forward to reading very soon. No
It's
embarrassment
available in the
at all.
festival
It's available.
bookshop. I have to say that this is the marketing pitch. The hottest sex is with an AI bot. So
No, it's funny in parts. It's very sexy in parts, and it's very, very touching. It's a beautiful love story at 3 different levels, and unapologetically bold and beautiful cover. I love the cover. I love the color, and brilliant. No embarrassment at all.
thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.